Hello, everybody. It is Saturday night at 10 o'clock Eastern Time. I am Chris Weave. I'm here with Alec Peters. How are you doing, Alec?
Doing well. Long day of work. I actually worked all day today, but other than that, that's, so c'est la vie. There are worse things that you could be doing on a Saturday.
Yeah, there are worse things.
Fighting Russians in Ukraine.
That's definitely one of them. My intent was to work all day today on a bunch of stuff I had to do, and I didn't get really much of it done at all, but I did get a little bit of it done, so that's good. Spent a lot of time on the phone sort of coordinating things, including some stuff about Marcon, so more about that in a moment. So we don't have Pat this week because Pat's off doing Navy Reserve stuff. We don't have Lissa this week because Lissa is not feeling well. She ate something that did not agree with her. And while she was originally somewhat loath to leave Alec and I unsupervised yet again, we also we convinced her that it was okay that we could be trusted for one more show without her. So
well, good. Yeah, I know. Yeah, don't leave the kids with the keys to the car.
Yeah. I always used to make jokes about when I'd leave town that I'd always have to lock up the liquor cabinet so that Buddy couldn't get drunk while I was gone. Back when I still had Buddy. So I can't remember. I've got a list of things to talk about before I continue doing the naval summary stuff I'm doing. Did we talk much about SpaceX Starship last week? I've had so many Starship conversations. I can't remember if you and I had one.
No, we did not. Did
you watch the launch?
I did not.
It was very interesting. It's worth going back and rewatching some of the video afterwards. The first view we got, they had lost several engines, and it's like, oh, that doesn't look good that they're losing them right off the bat. It made a lot more sense when you saw what had happened to the launch pad and how much concrete.
Oh, we did talk briefly about this. Yes.
Yeah, it was all over the place. So, but it seems to be the case that the more that people look at it, the more it looks like that's what happened, is that they just threw up a bunch of concrete all over the place.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, it dug a big hole. In fact, Scott Manley, who's one of the guys I listen to on YouTube, he described, there's RUDs, rapid unscheduled disassemblies.
Yeah, right.
He described it as rapid unscheduled digging because it's put this like 10 feet deep hole underneath it. I mean, it shattered the concrete. And then once you've shattered the concrete, it just threw it all over the place.
Wow.
And this is not like the concrete you go and buy at Home Depot. This was special high temperature concrete intended for applications like this. And that shows you just how powerful Starship actually is. So, or super heavy booster is, because it's
that's crazy.
Yeah. So I'm looking forward to seeing what they do the next time. So eventually there'll be a next time, but it's going to take a while.
Wow, crazy.
So I spent a lot of time. I'm on my Navy kick, my sort of World War II, World War I to World War II battleship development technology Navy kick. So I've been spending a lot of time reading about battleship design histories.
Oh, very good.
Including a very interesting article on the Montana class, which I had not realized some of the things that I discovered about the Montana class. I didn't realize it only had one rudder. The Iowas had two rudders, but they were going to go to a single rudder design, which struck me as being problematic.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay. Just for the redundancy?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of battleships usually have two rudders, at least the good ones do. And if anybody who's curious as to why you want to have two rudders, look up Bismarck,
exactly, right?
But they were going to go to a single rudder. It was also going to have the exact same propulsion plant as the Iowa class. So that's why it was a little bit slower, is that, it was going to be a much bigger ship, but with the same propulsion plant. And that also sort of kind of shows you one of the things about hydrodynamic effects in water is that drag increases as like the cube, if I remember correctly. And so you get to the point where ships just via hull form just naturally have a top speed, right? You get to the point where a ship really can't go any fast unless you just do, you have to like decrease the wetted area of the hull or something like that. And so that's why, ship top speeds are about the same. They've been the same for about 100 years. Because we got to the point where we could push the ship at the top speed for the hull form, and the hull forms are enough similar that the top speeds are enough similar. And so what that means on the one end is that you can, if you want to go any faster, if you're close to the top, like the hull of an Iowa class battleship, if you do the math, it could theoretically do like 34.5 knots based on that hull form. Everything else that comes up that you would add, every other variable would subtract from that. So it maxes out at 34.5 knots ish. And I think the top speed they ever recorded for any of the Iowas was 33.
Oh, okay.
And change. I want to say New Jersey did 33 and change on her speed trials. So, it's about as close to the theoretical max as you can get. When you take those same engines and put them in the much bigger ship of Montana, which is like, 10,000, 15,000 tons bigger, whatever it was, you don't end up with as big a drop as you might think, just because what you lose at the top end is in that high drag regime. So just like you need a lot to get you just a little bit faster, if you're subtracting speed off, power off, a big increase in the size, which is sort of the same power to weight ratio, a big increase in size isn't going to knock you down as much as you might think it would. I don't know if that made any sense.
No, yes, it does.
Now, I think that this is particularly interesting because most of the time when you start talking about spaceships, it's sort of silly to think in these terms because there's no equivalent of hydrodynamic forces, except in Star Trek there is. And that's how the warp fields work with the sort of, power levels increase and then they go down again as you go to the next warp factor, et cetera. It's something peculiar about the way subspace works and about how warp fields work. And so you end up with top speeds. You end up with it being, becomes asymptotically harder and, infinitely hard to get to warp 10, all the rest of it. And I think that Okuda and, okay, that's interesting. Where'd you go, Alec?
I had to switch browsers.
Okay. Because I saw you. So for those at home, I saw him come in on another window, and then the first one went away, and it's like, what the hell's going on?
Yeah. No, I just needed because I was this is one of my favorite charts, and you can't pull up stuff as easily in Firefox as you can in Chrome. So let me show you what I was
Oh yeah, I love that picture.
Yeah, it's a great kind of. How did I stop this from?
Although why it's Alabama as opposed to South Dakota, I don't know, but
I don't know. In the World of Warship games, they don't have the South Dakota; they have the Alabama.
Yeah, it's the South Dakota class though, but that's a pretty good. Yeah. I really like that.
Yeah, it's really interesting, especially because you see the difference in the hull shapes of, the Alabama and the North Carolina, it looks a lot more streamlined than the Alabama or the South Dakota, as you would say.
Yeah.
And then the Iowa is just, whoa, that's way bigger.
Yes.
What was the thinking there between the North Carolina? I mean, Alabama to North Carolina ain't that big a difference, but North Carolina, Iowa, that's a huge difference.
So they have different armor schemes. They have different torpedo protection schemes. In fact, the North Carolina class was sort of considered to be kind of light on torpedo protection. I've heard it described as North Carolina and Alabama are about the same tonnage. They sort of took North Carolina and squished it down to give better armor protection for the South Dakota class. And then they sort of stretched it back out while keeping the armor protection the same for the Iowas. Now, there's an awful lot of hand waving in that description, right? There's a lot of abbreviation in that description, because the armor schemes did look kind of different, etc. But North Carolina did not follow the standard practice of being armored against her own gun. And that's because North Carolina was originally going to be a 14-inch gun battleship, but there's an escalator clause in, I forget if it was the Washington or the London Naval Treaty, whichever one it was, that basically said, if somebody else pulls out of the treaty, everybody gets to upgun if they want.
Oh, geez.
And so, without violating the treaty. And so the Japanese pulled out, and they made a last minute decision to upgun the North Carolina class. But that's all they did. They just changed the guns, which works out. It turns out that that's easier than it might sound. I went and talked with my friend Chris Carlson about that, because it seemed to me like it would be a lot harder than that. And he said, no. All the ammunition handling stuff that you're worried about that you'd have to swap out to have bigger shells is all part of the turret structure itself. The turret structure goes down like 2 or 3 levels below deck. So the part that we think of as being the turret is just the penthouse on that structure. And it goes deep down, all the way down to basically where the magazines are. So when you replace the turret, you're replacing this basically 3-story building. And so they designed a new 3-story building and put it into place. But they couldn't do anything with the armor. So it's relatively lightly armored, considering. Now, I've heard people say really stupid stuff like, well, that means it wasn't a battleship. It was really a battle crew. No, that's not what that means, because it's not like the have to be able to defeat your own gun is some sort of law that's written down, that they passed it by an act of Congress and it doesn't count that. No, it's just a rule of thumb. Now, it's a good rule of thumb. It made sense. It wasn't arbitrary, because, if you're building a ship with 16-inch guns, the other guy's probably building ships with 16-inch guns, and you probably are going to have to deal with ships with 16-inch guns. So it's a pretty good rule of thumb, but it was just a rule of thumb. It wasn't magic or law or anything like that. The South Dakotas, they decided they wanted to increase the armor to deal with 16-inch guns, so they did. They also, but the end result was they sort of squished them down a little bit, because they were still trying to live within the treaty limits. And I've heard the South Dakotas described as being the best treaty compliant battleships that were ever designed. And I think that's probably true. They were kind of cramped on the inside, though. There was lots of complaints about, they just didn't have a whole lot of room to work. So one of these days, I really want to go and tour the Massachusetts, which is a South Dakota class, and then go do one of the Iowas like the next day. Because, I don't tour these ships back to back, and they're all just big ass ships when you're visiting them, right? So that's kind of hard to get to really appreciate the differences in scale if it's been like a year or two since you've been on a battleship. But there was something else I was going to say. Oh, so for the Iowas, Iowa had an interesting history of its gun, because it's got longer guns. They're 50 calibers as opposed to 45 calibers. And originally they were going to put they were going to put this other gun. Was it the Iowa they were going to do this with? Yeah, it was. I think it was the Iowa. They were originally going to put this older gun design on, but the Bureau of Ordnance and the ship constructing guys weren't talking to each other. So the Bureau of Ordnance was designing a gun for a turret ring that was a lot bigger than what the ship design guys were doing. And they only figured this out late in the process. And when they did, the answer came back, it's a lot easier to change the gun than it is to change the rest of the ship. So guess what, Bureau of Ordnance? You guys get to fix it. And I think the general board basically said, yeah, this is the Bureau of Ordnance's problem. That basically you guys screwed up. And there's even a quote from one of the members saying, like, it never occurred to you that you needed to get that information. It never occurred to you to ask.
I just love that there's a Bureau of Ordnance.
Yeah, well, and these were the same jokers that designed the shitty torpedo in World War II, that they then, they literally at one point, they had Bureau of Ordnance people have chain of custody of the torpedo from the moment it left their hands to the moment it was fired. They had a person with the torpedo the entire time on the ship, etc. And their conclusion was, we didn't see them do anything wrong, but it couldn't have been the torpedo, so they must have done something wrong. And I once attended a lecture at the Naval Historical Society that Captain Edward L. Beach was at, Ned Beach. So Ned's the guy who wrote Run Silent, Run Deep. He's the guy who invented the nuclear football, the idea of just having a naval officer with a briefcase with all the launch codes and just have him 10 feet away from the president at all times, right? He came up with that idea. He's got a building named after him in Annapolis. He is at the time he was a living legend. He's since passed on. First, he was the captain of the Triton, which did the first around the world entirely submerged trip. And so he was a submariner in World War II. And when the subject of those torpedoes came up, he was really pissed. I mean, this was in like 2003, right? This was like 60-year-old news. And he was still really pissed.
Damn.
I would be too. A lot of submariners died because of that torpedo. I mean, there was one instance where one of the ships, got several hits. They could see the torpedo hit the target, and they just didn't detonate. And then they later went and there was one submarine that did some test firing against a cliff. Right? How can you miss the cliff? And Bureau of Ordnance's response was, how dare you test our gear?
What?
Yeah. I mean, the guy got reprimanded for conducting the test and wasting the weapons. It's like none of them detonated. He fired like 10 shots and they didn't detonate. I don't think it was 10 shots, but he fired it. I mean, it was just amazing. Amazing. So Stephen Ross says, any relation to the guys who built the Zumwalt with guns that they couldn't afford to fire? That's a little bit different situation. That's one of those, originally the Zumwalt class was going to be huge. It was going to be like 30 hulls. And if you're building 30 hulls and they've got 2 guns per hull, so you're building 60 guns, and you're going to provision 60 guns, right? You're going to buy ammo for 60 guns. Your cost per round is going to be a lot lower. So the problem is that anytime you do your cost calculation based upon turnkey production like that you're just going to keep turning the crank and cranking them out, and then you only build a handful of them, they end up being really expensive. We saw the same thing happen with F-22. They could have doubled the buy on F-22 for just I forget what it was. It was like 4 billion more or something like that. I mean, it sounds like a lot of money, but I mean, it was a small percentage of what they had already spent, and they could have doubled the buy, because so much of it is the cost of that first airplane, right? All the R&D, et cetera. The first airplane is insanely expensive. The marginal cost of that airplane had come down dramatically, but they just chose not to do it. So, which makes me wonder, we never get any cost data on Star Trek, right? I personally would love to see a series based on Star Trek's acquisition department, right? I want to see their acquisition process, because I spent a lot of time doing acquisition stuff when I was working for the intelligence community, and some stuff like that when I was working for the Navy. So I'd love to know how their requirements process works, and how they calculate costs, et cetera. Because, we see Excelsiors show up forever and ever and ever and ever. And, there's still like a ton of Excelsior hulls around next gen. And yeah, I know that the real reason is that they had this model laying around in the production studio. So anytime they needed a ship, they could just grab that model and throw an Excelsior in front of the camera, and hey, we're good. But, I can explain why you would have so many Excelsiors around. And part of that is that they just, they were at a time where Starfleet was dramatically expanding, because, basically the Federation is a sphere, and they're trying to maintain coverage on the surface of the sphere. And so they've got to build a lot of ships to cover that. It had some initial teething problems, but they eventually decided they really liked it, and it was a really flexible design, and it was easily upgradable, et cetera. So they built a metric shit ton. So, and as a result of that, they kept them around forever, because it was worth their effort to do it. And their series production was so high, they were probably paying $1.57 by the time they got to the last ship. So, but, so let's see what next. Oh, one of the things that's come up, you may, I don't know if you remember, Alec, did we talk about the Winchell Chung triangle that talks the balance between propulsion and protection and armament?
Yes, we did.
So I've done a little bit. The more I pull the thread on that, the more I think that maybe that triangle, as Winch sort of presents it, works for World War I era, but by the time World War II rolls around, it doesn't work nearly as well. Because the Iowa class, the total amount of propulsion for the Iowa class was about 11% of the displacement. And it was about as fast as it could get. So it couldn't really get to even a third, with it being reasonable to spend that much displacement on just that one thing. But that's one of the things that I've said several times in the past about this, is that, back World War II or World War I era, you had this split between battle cruisers and battleships, because you had to make that trade-off. And by the time World War II rolls around, you've reached the hydrodynamic level on a couple of things had happened. Ships had gotten bigger, and with getting bigger, they're just hydrodynamically more efficient. When they got bigger, it also meant the volume increases greater than the outside dimensions. Because, like, if you think you double the length, double the width, double the height, 2 by 2 by 2 is 8. So, doubling the size of the ship increases the internal dimensions by a factor of 8. So you've got more room for gear inside. And the last thing was, steam technology just got a lot better. The gear, the World War II era gear was dramatically improved steam plants over the World War I era gear.
I got to go. I got a rescue emergency I got to take care of.
Okay. All right.
Solo. Take care.
See you later. Okay, that happened. So in any event, where was I? So the end result of that is that by the time World War II comes about, the different ship technologies, the different types of ships, it doesn't make any sense to have battle cruisers anymore, because you're really at that point talking about the difference between 26 or 27 knot and emphasizing, like the Montana's 26 or 27 knots, 28 knots. I've seen all three of those as being speeds for it. The Iowa's at 32 knots. So, okay, it's they're all going pretty fast, and there's not really a whole lot of difference. And the thing is, with those big ships, you got to be careful that you don't outrun your little ships. Now, it's not a matter of the big ships being faster. It's that you can't sustain the speed for long periods of time without burning through all your fuel. So destroyers have to refuel all the time anyway. And it only makes it worse if you're at the high end of the speed regime. So, oh well. Okay, let's go ahead and do the slide deck that I was going to do. So, and I forgot to change the date on the front, but that really should say 29 April, because it's the 29 April slides. And so I think I'm just going to remove. Hey, somebody just pointed out that I muted myself on the show because I did the wrong thing. I took myself out of the show rather than I stopped the camera. So apparently Lissa was wrong. I couldn't be left unsupervised. Okay, so let me do this again. Here's and thank you very much for Tom Pope for sending me the text message. Tom doesn't usually listen to the show live. I'm really glad he did this night. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the camera to, let's see. Let me change a setting real quick. Sorry about this. There we go. That's what I'm trying to do. All right. Somewhat Chris-centric schedule. Next week, I am at DemiCon in Des Moines, Iowa, gaming with my brothers and hanging out with my dad early in the week. The following, the 13th of May, I'll do a show. The 20th of May, I'm at my nephew's graduation, so I won't be there the 20th. The 27th, I won't be there because of Marcon, so no show then. 3rd of June, we're good again, so I'll do a show the 3rd of June. 10th of June, and I don't even remember what's going on the 10th of June, but I remember I'm unavailable. And then until like late July, I should be totally available. Unclear what Pat's schedule is going to look like, because Pat's actually working some extra hours these days, and he's he's got to go fly and do stuff like that. So, and he doesn't get scheduled until fairly shortly. So he never knows until about 3 weeks in advance what his schedule is going to look like. So going to do the group events at some point, but let's not talk about them. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Marcon. So Marcon is the 26th through 28th of May, and I say plus there because there's going to be some stuff going on beforehand, and there's going to be some stuff going on afterwards that I'm doing. So I'm going to basically run my own little green room at the con. It's going to start on Thursday, and some friends are coming into town. And then we plan on keeping the room all the way through Sunday night. Monday morning, I'll check out of it. So it's basically, I've got my own little con suite there. Don't know what I'm going to have for food yet, though I think I'm going to have some, but it's really a place where you can come. Anybody who wants to can come and hang out with myself and some of the other BU9 guys. And, we'll see if we can do a party. I'm trying this as an experiment. Maybe that I conclude that this is not a good experiment. But we'll see. I may never do this again. So this is a good time to come in and check it out. On Memorial Day, the plan is those who are planning on doing this, we wake up in Columbus and then drive to Dayton, which is about an hour away. And then we do the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force. And then after we're done, we can go out to eat. And people at that point, everybody's on their own. So if you're staying in town, if you're going to stay overnight, get a hotel room to stay overnight in Dayton and then head out. So any of you who are listening that want to be part of this, here's what you need to do. You need to register for the con. You need to get a hotel room at the con. You need to get a hotel room in Fairborn, Ohio, near the Air Force Museum, the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force. And then you also need to tell me that you are coming so that I can make sure that I send you updates and give you my phone number and all that other stuff that I don't want to do on YouTube. So there is the phone number, or the phone number, the email address, starfleettac@gmail.com. So please send me an email and let me know if you're going to come. There are links to the convention. So I'm copying that information. I am going to the comments and I am putting it in the comments. So, and let me do that again because it ran it all together. So there's marcon.org. They're actually better about updating the Facebook group. And so who all's going to be at this con? David Weber is going to be the guest of honor. Andy and Joelle Presby are going to be there. Friend Tom Pope's going to be there. My friend Patrick Childs is going to be there. They're all Bain authors. Other members of BU9 are going to be there. And I'm going to be there as the fan guest of honor. So I'm like doing the initial master of ceremony stuff, et cetera, et cetera. So anybody who can make it, that would be fantastic. So Donnie has an interesting comment. I'm going to toss it up here. He says he still wishes the USAF would have been renamed the Aerospace Force instead. That's an interesting thing. At one point I thought about that too, because there's been a couple of instances where it's been suggested and they've thought about it and they always backed off of it. And one of the reasons why it may not make sense to do that is sort of what we ended up seeing happen with Space Force breaking off. And that is they don't really use the same systems. The space portion of it and the air portion of it really don't touch each other, except for the fact that a booster starts on the ground and goes through the air to get to space. Other than that, they're just not really the same thing. They're really kind of different things. And the other thing is, as Jens points out, we were never really into that name or mission really. So yeah, that's really true. There's just really not a whole lot. The Air Force sort of did that stuff as an extra thing. It wasn't really as big a focus as the air component portion was. So I sort of get why they didn't do it, although I do think that Aerospace Force sounds way cooler. Okay, next slide. So we're going to keep on going with the naval combat discussion. So tonight we're going to do Karl Lautenschlager. And then the plan is that the next session that we do, I'm going to do sort of the science fiction summary of everything that's come so far. And then I hopefully by that point, I'll be ready to sort of take it to the next step. You may recall the reason why we're doing all this is because I was cranking along doing Navy stuff, sort of trying to tie it into science fiction, tie it into Star Trek, et cetera, et cetera. And that all came to a screeching halt when I ended up in the hospital and was basically combat ineffective for 6 weeks. And so there was a time there where, I was doing shows, but I really didn't have the stamina to go through and put together presentations. For some of those shows, I'd sort of prop myself up in front of the camera and I'd do the show, and then I was like down for the count afterwards. But I'm glad I got a chance to do those. And I'm really, really lucky that TJ Zazadlo and Rob Davidoff came in about that time to do all the Battlestar Galactica stuff and the Starfleet captains and the Starfleet admirals and all the other stuff that they did that really, really helped in a time period where I just didn't have the stamina that I'd like to do. Now, that having been said, I've got a long list of things I want to take a look at. That list keeps getting longer the more I pull the thread on stuff. So I'm trying to put it all together in such a way, because what I sort of view is what I'm trying to accomplish here is this isn't about whether a particular work of science fiction, Star Trek or whatever is correct. It's about going through and learning how to think about naval combat using historical examples so that when we think about it in a science fiction framework, we've got a foundation to build on. It's not about filing the serial numbers off, although if somebody wants to do that, that's great. It's about trying to sort of figure out how to think like a naval analyst. And I've always said that my fandom superpowers, I can talk about real world navies and science fiction navies at the same time. So that's what I do. Okay, so topic for tonight is Karl Lautenschlager. So he wrote a couple of articles that I think are really, really good. The Dreadnought Revolution Reconsidered, where he talks specifically about what made Dreadnought special, and technology and the evolution of naval warfare. If I've got the time, I'll sort of go through the entire Lautenschlager thing. At some point, I may decide to split it into two. But I've never met him. I'd love to. He retired in 2011 from Los Alamos National Laboratory. He published a handful of articles in the 1980s about naval topics. And at one point he did one on tanks and some other stuff but by and large, not a whole lot of stuff out there. But at some point I discovered these two things that he had written, and they were sort of fundamental. I discovered them circa 2002, 2003-ish. And they were fundamental in sort of changing my perception of how to think about some of these topics. And so they're good frameworks. And the only thing I wish I did is that in retrospect, the next time, if I ever do this as an integrated talk, again, I'm going to start with Lautenschlager and then go to Lanning. I kept him for the last, and I should have done him first. I kept him in the same order that I did him originally when I should have done him first. Okay. So let's talk about the revolution of naval combat. And first of all, let's talk about ships. So there's this revolution in naval combat capability that takes place between 1907 and 1914. 1907 is when the HMS Dreadnought first came out. 1914, of course, the beginning of World War II. Then you've got the Battle of Jutland in May of 1916. But in May, beginning of June, something like that. I think it's the very end of May, if I remember correctly. In any event, in that time period in between the start of the war and when Jutland took place, you do have some naval combat that takes place, but no real big fleet actions. Those all ended up happening later. Jutland was the big action of that war. There was some smaller actions which sort of gave you an idea of where things were going, but there was only like one giant fleet action. The conventional wisdom is that when Dreadnought came out in 1907, she represented a technological watershed by implementing a whole bunch of new technology. The thing is, this is wrong for a couple of reasons. First of all, the technology really wasn't new. All the technology that we saw that came out in Dreadnought had been in the fleet for a while. There had been other ships that did it. What was new was how all that stuff was integrated together. It was a systems integration problem. The second reason it wasn't true is because it wasn't just dreadnoughts. It was there was a dramatic change across the entire fleet. So what you ended up with is between 07 and 14, there was a dramatic increase in combat power by these two different forms of systems integration. Combination of existing technology that led to greatly improved fire control and thereby gunnery in the dreadnought battleship and the development of the torpedo boat destroyer into a vital element of the battle line. So you had systems integration in terms of creating this idea of escorts that fought during the battle, and also with this idea of improving fire control and making gunnery of dreadnought battleships better. Okay, so and I've been saying 1907 when Dreadnought was actually launched in 06, but when Dreadnought first hit the water, there's only one of her, and you're kind of looking at her going like, okay, what do you do with this thing, right? It sort of takes a while to sort of integrate it into the fleet, and you really only started seeing that integration a little bit later. So Dreadnought battleships are named after the HMS Dreadnought, characterized by all big gun armament and relatively high speed. So what does all big gun armament mean? That means a main battery that's all big guns. It doesn't mean it didn't have small guns along with it, like you had quick firing guns for dealing with torpedo boats and stuff like that. What it means is that it's really focused on big guns, and if they had the choice of putting a big gun that could shoot a long distance, previous battleships would frequently do things like they'd have 12-inch guns and they'd have 8-inch guns and they might have 6-inch guns. And that's because the smaller the gun, as a general rule, the greater the rate of fire. And so in some cases, they're aiming, they're trying to get a volume of fire versus hitting power. So the all big gun armament really just meant that the main battery was all big guns. It wasn't that you didn't have these smaller guns on board. The end result of this, of all the improvements that I'm going to go through, was that you ended up with twice the effective fighting range and at least twice the hitting power of what you had before. And you did that through linking a bunch of different systems together that had synergistic effects of each other, so that it ended up functioning as one system rather than a bunch of individual systems. Before that time, all the guns of a battleship basically were their own thing. Then once happens here is that it, once Dreadnought came aboard, you fought the entire battleship as all the guns as a battery, as opposed to just individual things that were shooting. And the end result of that is that almost overnight, you doubled the range from about 5,000 to 7,000 yards up to 10,000 to 14,000 yards, the effective range, while maintaining your ability to hit and maintaining the weight of your broadside. So Dreadnought fire control, what all figured into Dreadnought fire control? First of all, you had single observer optical rangefinder. So you had one person or one team of people that are getting the range and getting all the bearing information. It goes out to all the guns. You're spotting your gunfire, so you're giving correction. Okay, that was long, that was short, et cetera, et cetera. You're getting correction to the guns. You've got electrical communications doing all this stuff, so you're not trying to yell down voice tubes in the middle of a battle. It's actually, you can see printed information on the gears. So a dial tells you what direction to point your gun and what to set all your stuff for. You've got main battery guns that are all uniform caliber, so they've all got the same ballistic calculations associated with them, the same ballistic characteristics. So you're doing the calculation once for all the main battery. You're not trying to do it for a multitude of batteries. And then you've also got director spotting. And so you've got a director who's sort of controlling all the guns and salvo firing all the guns at the same time. And one of the things that Lautenschlager points out is that if you don't know what you were looking for, most of the stuff is invisible, right? If you know what you're looking for, you can see, okay, that's the spotting area, and I can see the optical rangefinder, but you certainly can't see the electrical cables inside. And you certainly, some of the stuff is procedural, like we're going to do, battery firing, etc. You can look and see that the guns are, similar sizes. They appear to be similar sizes, but a lot of it's sort of hard to see. The important stuff is hard to see if you don't know what you're looking for. So the other thing he talks about is destroyers. Destroyers came about first to counter torpedo boats and then to replace them. Because while torpedo boats were reasonably stealthy, and by that I mean, in this case, you're talking about visual stealth, they were close to the water, they were hard to see, but that also meant that they were small. They had limited top speed endurance, so they were fast, but not for very long. They were relatively short range. They were relatively slow considering, because they for the hydrodynamic reasons we went into earlier. They just had generally poor seakeeping. They're small boats and they get tossed around by the waves. And they weren't as effective as their proponents thought they would be, because the counter to that was lots of quick firing guns, and the quick firing guns got better over time, and they generally were able to reach out and touch those, even with all that stuff they were doing to make them hard to hit. They were generally able to reach out with enough of an effective range that they were able to stay ahead of the torpedo boat problem. So at some point, a decision was made to build torpedo boat destroyers to deal with these things and to sort of keep them off the back of the battleships. And the torpedo boat destroyers were bigger, and they had better seakeeping. They had greater fuel reserves. Steam turbines really just meant that they could have really relatively efficient, long duration, high speed. And they could mount guns. They could mount a fair number of quick firing guns, at least way more than a torpedo boat could. And the end result of this is that they made fairly effective. At some point, somebody said, why don't we put torpedoes on these things? And they ended up making fairly effective torpedo boats themselves. In fact, more effective than the actual torpedo boats did. So they ended up with two missions, the offensive torpedo mission and the defensive anti-torpedo mission. And, as a general rule, if you were Royal Navy or U.S. Navy, you sort of viewed the defensive mission as being more important and the offensive mission as secondary. If you were Continental, you sort of viewed it the other way, especially the Kriegsmarine. And you also had better communications because you had electric lights that you could use, which helped at night and cut through the gloom. You also had, later on, you had radio, and that really made integration with the fleet possible. So now you're spreading out your effective capability out to a much wider area. And instead of just having the battle line be your combat ships, now you've got a layered defense with specialty ships that are part of it. Okay. So the stuff on the right is sort of how Lautenschlager talks about the development of battle fleets over time. I sort of bend it a little bit different way. So I'm going to go through the topics on the right-hand side real quick about all the different things that Lautenschlager has to say about those things. So auto maneuver just means that you've got steam engines and screw propellers and you're not worried about the wind. And that really rewrote the book on naval warfare. So at first, you just use them for, steam engines were only useful for tactical mobility. You still had sails. What that picture you're looking at is a steamship with sails, which is this weird bastard thing, but you use the sails to cross the ocean, and then you use the steam plant for tactical mobility. And the reason why you did that is you didn't have a whole lot of coal, and your engines were kind of unreliable. And wherever you got, you needed coal there. And if you didn't have coaling stations, which nobody did at this point, you had to bring all your coal with you. And so the idea of steaming across the ocean was not particularly viable, but you could use the wind to get you there. And then once you were there, you could use your tactical drive to move around. Doesn't that sound kind of science fiction-y, right? You use your jump drive to get between systems, and then you use your maneuver drive once you're there. Maybe use your warp drive, and then you use your impulse drive once you're there. That's kind of similar to what we see in some science fiction. Hold on a second. So eventually you end up with the ability to just sort of steam everywhere because you build coaling stations and you build a logistics train. And if you think about it, that really changes how warfare works. In the old days, you could load on the days of like Admiral Nelson, you load the ship full of food and water. They could stop in to get water and maybe some other provisions when they needed to. But, you know, a ship could go out and stay at sea for 6 months. Stuff like that happened all the time. These are not ships that can stay at sea for 6 months. These are ships that had to go and do something. You know, they had to put into port. They had to have a logistics train. They couldn't just go and spend all their time at sea. Okay, long-range weapons. Basically, you know, what we saw happening in this time period is weapon ranges increased dramatically. The guns got better, and including the ability to penetrate. This ended up having follow-on effects, like because the guns were better and the guns could penetrate wood better, it forced the adoption of iron armor. Although it's been pointed out that iron armor versus rifled projectiles is really close to the penetration capability of oak wooden sides versus cannonballs. So you didn't really change your ability to damage the other ship, at least in the early days. What you changed was your ability to shoot at long range and shoot highly accurately. So it pushed the battle out. There's a recurring theme in naval combat of the naval combat taking place at longer and longer ranges, at least during the gun era. So the hit rate stayed about the same for long periods of time, but what happened is those hits happened at longer and longer ranges. So he also talks about, there's two ways to really think about armor. You can get increased protection for a given weight and thickness as the armor got better, or decreased weight and thickness for a given level of protection. So early on, you had this very thick iron armor, and then when you had steel armor, and then face-hardened steel armor, et cetera, as the armor improved, you didn't necessarily get better protection, but what you got was lighter armor, and you could spend some of that, the rest of that displacement, you could spend on propulsion and guns and stuff like that. So that's one of the things you'll notice is that as ships got, part of it was also ships getting bigger, but back in the pre-dreadnought era, you wouldn't have very many large guns. You wouldn't have nearly as many guns, period. And then we started getting more and more guns as the armor got better and as the ships got bigger. Okay, high seas combat is basically what happened is you got to the point where you started seeing battles being fought out at sea. Way out at sea. In the age of sail, it was really unusual to fight a battle that wasn't fairly close to land. Maybe not in sight of land, but relatively close to land. The only example I can think of was Glorious 1st of June, which was a meeting engagement between the French and the British, where they just stumbled across each other in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Shit happens, but it doesn't happen very often. And so as fleets got bigger, as they got faster, as the engines got more reliable, as you ended up with better communication capabilities through radio and lights and stuff, the ships spread out and they were able to see things farther away, and they were able to do scouting better. And you ended up with battles didn't have to take place near ports. They didn't have to take place near land. You could go out and find somebody out in the middle of the ocean. So integrated systems is really sort of going back to that first thing about the Dreadnought. Yeah, for a more in-depth version, see the earlier slides. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next one. 3-medium combat is something originally it's all surface combat, right? It's ships floating on the surface of the ocean. Then you started getting subsurface combat. Then you've got submarines, and then you later add air into the mix. Aircraft dramatically changed the picture because they've got 10 times the range and they're a lot faster. I'm going to spend some time in a future episode talking about all the thinking that I've been doing about fighters in science fiction and fighters in Star Trek in particular. But part of that is going to be how do you classify these things? What's the right sort of mental model to have? Is it the case in science fiction combat that you would expect something analogous to this 10 times increase in range that you got with real world aircraft? An aircraft carrier is a way of having your cake and eating it too. It's a way of having the advantages of being able to operate in the domain of the air and be able to operate on the surface of the ocean at the same time. That's a really, really different sort of look than what you had before. It also led to a lot of ship specialization because you couldn't really have a ship that could do everything well. And so the idea was that you had specialized ships to do specific pieces of it. And, new weapons, torpedoes, things like that. So you also ended up with Lautenschlager didn't call them integrated sensor grids, but I will. Computerized data links between the sensor and the platform, between the platform and the weapon, between platforms. Over time, as you go from the 40s to the 50s to the 60s, you get more and more instances of stuff being passed around, data being passed around. It starts off as just radio and passing track numbers and sending information that way. But over time, it gets increasingly automated. Now the computers are talking to each other and putting stuff up on the screen. And now you've even got to the point where the computers are processing data from sensors that are attached to other platforms. So when when two Aegis ships using cooperative engagement capability are doing their thing, one ship is processing raw data that came from the other ship. That's a big change. And I'm going to spend some time at one point, I think, talking about track versus targeting quality data. I'm not going to go into it today, but that's going to be something I need to talk to. Okay, so what did we learn from Lautenschlager? In general, what we learned is that this idea of a single breakthrough is popular mythology. We've got lots of instances where combinations of technology brought big changes, and they led to changes in the individual platforms. They led to changes in the types of platforms that you had. And those changes were such that they dramatically increased the capabilities and meant that anybody who didn't follow along was left hopelessly obsolete. But it's very rare to see something where it was just like we got this brand spanking new weapon and the super weapon is going to change things. You see super weapons all the time in Star Trek. You see super weapons all the time in science fiction. But that's just not really the way it works in the real world. It's really frequently more of a systems integration function. So it's a synthesis of bringing a bunch of things together in a way that can lead to fundamental changes. And that systems integration can be on a single platform, like you saw on, say, the Dreadnought, or it can be between platforms, like you saw in the development of the destroyer and the changes over time when you added submarines and you added airplanes and added all that other stuff. And the last thing is that sometimes those changes are really very subtle and they're difficult to determine, because if you don't know what you're looking at, you may not realize how important it is. Radar antennas are like that. It's like, okay, that ship has a different radar antenna. What's the big deal, right? And you used to have this one, now it's got this one. Well, there's lots of issues that you can okay, I just got a notice saying that the feed has stopped. If anybody can still hear me, please say something in the chat. Can you all still hear me? Can anybody still hear me? Okay. All right. So it looks like the notice I got said that I couldn't be heard, but most of you hear me 5 by 5. So thank you very much. So let's see, where was I? Important changes may be very subtle to detect if you don't know what you're looking at. Sometimes you just, it's like, okay, they replaced one antenna with another antenna. Why is that important? If you know about antennas, you can figure out what's important. You can look at an antenna and go, oh, okay, that's different. You can measure the wavelength that the antennas deal with by its shape. You can get some ideas about how it works, etc. Okay, so next time I'm going to go through and I'm going to do conclusions. I'm going to talk about what we see in science fiction. And I'm not really going to go a whole lot longer. I'm going to check real quick to see if there's anything in the comments that I need to reply to, because I don't know if you all noticed, but my throat's beginning to go. Yeah, today's been, the weather keeps changing in Ohio, and every time the weather changes, especially when the cold weather rolls in, I end up with a sinus headache. And so I'm fighting one off, and I think I'm going to lose this fight. So I've got some ibuprofen in my future. Bob makes a comment about space combat resiliency will be measured by having multiple platforms capable of performing the same function in overlapping capacities. That fundamentally makes sense to me. Real world space combat is so different than anything that we see in science fiction, because the capabilities we have are so limited compared to what we see in science fiction. I mean, every spacecraft we've ever built, every satellite we've ever built, et cetera, is effectively standing still compared to even the simple stuff we see in science fiction. It effectively doesn't move. And so I don't have a good feel for how real world contemporary space combat would work. It's not my specialty. I'm a Navy guy, fundamentally. I'm not really an orbits guy. I'm not really a space guy. As capabilities improve in science fiction terms, right? I can tell you, I can analyze Battlestar Galactica way better than I can our current capabilities, because it's just Battlestar Galactica is closer to the sort of thing that I know about in terms of how to think about it. That doesn't mean that the current stuff isn't really useful. It does mean, luckily, in some ways, because I don't speak for my employer doesn't speak for me. And it's one of those things that potentially real world space combat is close enough to my day job that I wouldn't be able to talk about it anyway. Okay, I'm dialing back. Okay, so one last thing. Like I said, if y'all are interested in coming, if you're planning on coming to MarCon, please send me an email at starfleettac, TAC, at gmail.com. Just let me know that you're coming. And if you think you're going to stay and go to the Memorial Day thing at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, let me know about that too. But if you send a note to me, then I'll try to let you know what's going on. I'll try to tell you where things are going to be, et cetera, et cetera. Like I said, don't know if this experiment's going to be something I'm going to repeat in the future. We'll have to see how this works out. I can tell you that renting a con suite type room is reasonably pricey. So it may be something I conclude is not worth doing the next time around. But I appreciate the fact that you're all here and you all choose to spend your Saturday night with me. And hopefully we'll get a report from Alec on exactly how this rescue went. Next time I'll finish up on the naval topic, this particular set of naval review episodes, and then I'll move forward into doing new stuff. So fighters in space, Renegade Legion Prefect, some stuff on networks, some stuff on some specific books that I'm reading, going back and rereading. In trying to sort of synthesize a bunch of this stuff together. The only bad part is I'm now at the point where all the stuff I'm looking at is generally book length. And that means that I'm, having to pedal faster to keep up. So I'll do one last little sweep. So Bob says it's part of his job, but he doesn't speak for any employers, past, present, or future either. Okay, good to know, Bob. Looking forward to the next time you and I run into, because Bob and I run into each other occasionally. In fact, if I had been at RavenCon, I might have seen him last weekend. But looking forward to having that conversation with you in person sometime. Stephen Ross says probably something like the Interceptor from UFO. I love UFO. I think the original design of the Interceptor I like a little bit better than what they ended up going with, but I just love UFO, and I would love to see I would love to see what they originally intended for Space 1999. It was going to be UFO Season 2. They were going to jump the timeline forward like 2 decades or a decade or something like that. And Ed Straker was going to be, the moon base was going to be Shadow's moon base upgraded. They were going to build a new moon base for Shadow, and Ed Straker was going to command the defense of the Earth from the moon. And that would have been fantastic, but that's not what we saw. So, all right then. With that in mind, I think I'm going to go ahead and call it an evening. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for spending your Saturday night with me. And I will not see you next week, but I will see you the week after. And live long and prosper.